Yes, I'm delighted to introduce our last speaker, Alberto Toscano, who is joining us from British Columbia, and it's very early for him, so we're very grateful for his participation. Alberto teaches at the School of Communications in Simon Fraser University in Canada, and he's a critical theorist and the author of several books, among which an early book was Fanaticism on the Uses of an Idea, which was first published in 2010. And his latest book is Late Fascism, Race, Capitalism, and the Politics of Crisis, which is obviously why he's taking part in the talk today. Alberto is also a member of the editorial board of the journal Historical Materialism, and he has translated a lot of work from Antonio Negri, Badiou, Fortini, and Furio Jesi. So Alberto's latest book on late fascism explores fascism not as a monolithic ideology or system, but rather in its various nexuses with capitalism, for which fascism was always a possibility for capitalism. And he examines these relations notably through the lens of racial domination and oppression. But the political economy dimension of that nexus was not a major focus of the book, which is why we are looking forward to Alberto's talk today to bring it that complementary analysis, which is very fitting for our seminar. So Alberto, the floor is yours for 25 to 30 minutes and then 10 minutes question. But it's up to you to decide how much you want to talk, how much you want questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Isabel, and thanks to everybody who's put this together. Yeah, I'm sorry that the time difference meant that I could only catch the last half of Vladimir's talk and missed Dorit's, but I hope I'll get a chance to watch them or read them later. I certainly was very sympathetic to the discussion of populism that we just ended on, and hopefully has some resonances with what I'll be talking about. The insight that to critically understand and counter fascism, it is indispensable to grasp it as a pathology imminent to capitalism is as old as the phenomenon itself. Max Horkheimer made this insight into a kind of slogan when he said in 1939, anyone who does not wish to discuss capitalism should also stay silent on the subject of fascism, which 30-some years later, Nikos Poulantzas later amended to anyone who does not wish to discuss imperialism should also stay silent on the subject of fascism. From outside the Marxist tradition, Karl Polanyi observed, I quote, that in order to comprehend German fascism, we must revert to Ricardian England. For it was by attending to the social history of classical political economy that we could learn how fascism was, as he put it, merely the outcome of the mutual incompatibility of democracy and capitalism in our time. Fascism, for the author of The Great Transformation, was best defined as that revolutionary solution which keeps capitalism untouched. Behind this lay the thesis of a kind of longue durée of fascist potentials grounded in what he termed the recrudescence of the old hostility of capitalism to popular government. Now, crucially, this hostility is not that of a merely anti-democratic conservatism. It is, pace Polanyi, a new hostility that needs to make itself popular, though not necessarily populist. So, when the dominant economic groups in Weimar Germany faced both a social crisis of capital accumulation and a crisis of political hegemony, when they could neither coordinate the interests of different fractions of capital nor secure dependable voting blocks that would bind subordinate groups to themselves and to their interests, authoritarian liberalism did not prove a durable fix. If, as the historian David Abram argued in The Collapse of Weimar Germany, a contradiction between the demands of democracy and the needs of capitalism was at the core of the organic crisis of the early 1930s, the fascist abrogation of democracy needed to go through democracy, through the winning of a mass basis for measures that would secure capital accumulation and break the back of trade union power. In light of the inability of fragmented dominant groups to organize and unify their interests and to mobilize a mass base anchoring ruling class hegemony, National Socialism became an increasingly attractive expedient for the social consolidation of capitalism. A liberal framework that can only think of fascism as the aberrant exception and opposite of representative democracy and the rule of law is predicated on the notion that fascism and true capitalism are somehow antithetical. There's a minor tradition of economic thought which refutes this view. It is stated most pithily indeed in Polanyi's dictum, which I used as the epigram to late fascism. The problem of fascism is as old as capitalism. The threat was there from the start. This is from an essay in 1934 called The Fascist Virus. Writing about fascism in America in the midst of the Korean War, the economist Paul Baran wrote of how the big business military coalition could carry out all the tasks of a fascist regime, securing through state power a mass basis for capitalist domination while disorganizing any challenge from below, while only adopting its classic forms abroad. And again, this reminds us of Poulantzas's point about fascism and imperialism. In the wake of the Kennedy assassination and Barry Goldwater's presidential turn, the Polish economist Michael Kalecki advanced that fascism in our time, this is the title of his 1964 essay, could dispense with demagogic redistributive claims and promote laissez-faire, anchor itself in racist or chauvinist slogans, from Algérie française to segregation, 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 slogans of the 1960s, and find itself subsidized by the most reactionary fractions of capital, while being kept, as he put it in a telling metaphor, like a dog on a leash, and I guess dogs sometimes get off the leash, and that indeed is the issue, by the ruling class as a whole. As Kalecki put it, again in 1964, the majority of the ruling class does not like the idea of the fascists seizing power, but at the same time, it does not wish to crush them. The fascism of our times is a dog on a leash. It can be unleashed at any time to achieve definite aims, and even when on the leash, serves to intimidate the potential opposition. For Kalecki, what dictated the shape of counter-revolution in the 1960s, from Algeria to the US, was the fact that, as he put it, the main driving force of the fascist movement is the potential emancipation of the oppressed nations, or decolonization in the broad sense. Even as mainstream a liberal economist as Paul Samuelson would find himself forced by the emergence of the military dictatorships in Latin America in the 1960s and 1970s to revise the hard and fast dichotomy he'd posited between capitalism on the one hand and democracy on the other in his very famous and massively published 1948 textbook, Economics. In the 1970s and 80s editions of the same book, the regimes in Brazil, Argentina, and Chile were defined as imposed capitalism, market fascism, or fascist capitalism, in polemic with the likes of Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, who were feted by the juntas at the same time. While making unpopular capitalist measures popular and not letting crises go to waste for the sake of a reassertion of class power are dynamics that have indeed not gone away, something that can also be said for the question of decolonization, our conjuncture differs in ways worth attending to. To sketch out how, let me turn to a crucial nexus of the contemporary ascendancy of the far right, namely the ideological knot that ties together appeals to native workers, anti-immigrant racism, and the claim to roll back so-called globalism. This takes multiple forms worldwide. Here I want to just focus on the US case and then return to some analytical remarks and methodological remarks made by Stuart Hall vis-a-vis the UK some years ago that I think are still useful. State racism in the name of workers' interests. This is not the only answer to the perennial question, what is fascism? But it is in many ways a compelling one. Now that mass deportations, starting with the Haitian residents of Springfield, have joined sealed borders and drill baby drill as keystones of the Republican platform, it is evident, if doubts still lingered, that the much discussed turn to the working class of the GOP is inseparable from an assault on the rights, livelihood, and safety of immigrant workers. While the Trump campaign has publicized pro-worker protective tariffs, or supposedly pro-worker protective tariffs, thus challenging Democrats to shake off their globalist commitments, and MAGA Republicans have signaled support for the antitrust work of FTC Chair Lina Khan, the GOP's core pitch remains that of assuaging the fears of the so-called American worker by ramping up terror against their non-American or un-American peers. As Teamster President Sean O'Brien's dismal appearance at the Republican National Convention a few weeks or a couple of months ago confirmed, not everyone in the labor movement carries antibodies against the chauvinist virus. Some of Trump's cheerleaders have even drawn explicitly on this historical heritage of American pro-worker racism. An opinion piece in Newsweek, whose title wouldn't have gone amiss in indeed far-right or even neo-Nazi publications. The title in Newsweek was "Springfield is Emblematic of America's Immigration Death Spiral." I was told by journalist friends that apparently Newsweek has been taken over by extremely right-wing forces, but nevertheless, it left me a little surprised. This article references AFL-CIO historical founder Samuel Gompers, himself a Jewish immigrant from London's East End, linking of the collapse of fair wages for American workers to the incessant supply of low-cost migrant labor. And I think this kind of like historical memory of this is sort of interesting in its own right. Allowing the mist of bigotry to disappear the history of US labor struggles in which immigrant workers were most often at the vanguard, the article goes on to talk of corporations relishing the fact that, quote, "the Haitians they've hired won't ever complain about their pay nor attempt to unionize." This is, of course, deeply ironic, considering that it was usually immigrant workers who were the first to try to unionize or indeed to complain about their pay. Gompers, of course, was a strong backer as AFL leader of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and the author of the wildly racist pamphlet titled "Some Reasons for Chinese Exclusion: Meat versus Rice, American Manhood Against Asiatic Coolieism." So this too is a history of the labor movement, and we would do well also to remember it. Trump's much derided and much lampooned and extremely dangerous racist claims about eating dogs and cats and so on and so forth is a grotesque descendant of Gompers' slander of Chinese workers. In this text, he writes, "As to their morality, they have no standard by which a Caucasian might judge them." Almost a century later, workers' xenophobia still seems to pay some dividends if J.D. Vance's address is anything to go by. Promising, I quote, to commit to the working man and claiming that Trump is not in the pocket of big business, which is, we go through those, not just the funding elements, but if we go through who wrote, Project 25 or whatever other programs we're talking about, this statement would, explode. Vance anchored his speech in the claim that because of Biden, quote, "our country was flooded with cheap Chinese goods, with cheap foreign labor, and in the decades to come, just to add, deadly Chinese fentanyl," which is a kind of this now moral panic that this is a kind of mechanism to undo American society, even though, of course, it's well known that it's mainly brought in by US citizens. While resonating with a strain of nativism and supremacism in the history of the labor movement in the US, the reactionary framing of worker versus migrant is aimed less, and this I think resonates with some of the points that Vladimir was just making, less at the factory floor than at pandering to what has been bitingly termed by the journalist Eric Levitz, the tyranny of the unwoke white swing voter. This tyranny had already led centrist Democrat strategists in the Clinton and Obama years to concoct schemes to capture the so-called white working class. Now, it's very important to note, as David Roediger's laid out in an excellent book called The Sinking Middle Class, that this was actually a Democrat formula before it became a Republican one, right? And aimed principally in a kind of psephological, electoral, strategic horizon, right? The principal function of this discourse, in which, as Roediger observed, and I like this formulation, the accent will always fall on white and the mumbling on working class, is to ventriloquize workers to preempt any consequential demands for justice redistribution and a betterment of the social wage. Here lie the roots of the mobilization of the worker against the woke, which finds its precedent in the hard hat riots of 1970, where construction workers attacked anti-war students in New York, but also the deeper logic of the rebranding of the Republican Party as a so-called party of the workers. Namely, that of providing a mass electoral base for a project retrenching capital's domination amid global economic slowdown and increasing volatility instigated by climate disaster and war. That, after all, was where the expediency of interwar fascism itself lay, and why it was, at least initially, greeted by pioneering neoliberal thinkers like Luigi Einaudi in Italy and von Mises in Austria. As different fractions of capital vied for increasing portions of a diminishing pie, and authoritarian liberal governments failed to garner any popular legitimacy and pacify restive masses, fascists promised a fix for a weakened state and beleaguered capital alike. Or, as Du Bois wonderfully put it apropos of the North's collusion in the defeat of Reconstruction, in the late 19th century, a counter-revolution of property. The conundrum in the 1920s and 1930s was how to mobilize a mass base for a project to shore up the profitability of domestic capital as a world market fragmented and war loomed. Yesterday, like today, this was more reliant, and again, this was corroborated by some of the arguments that Vladimir was making, more reliant on dejected middle strata than struggling proletarians, though the native worker or producer and their heteropatriarchal families stood at the rhetorical center. As Jamie Merchant has perceptively analyzed in his recent book, Endgame, Economic Nationalism and Global Decline, though the lineaments of today's ascendant authoritarians don't match those of the ultranationalist mass movements of a century ago, not least because, many of the parties that we're talking about don't actually resemble mass movements and certainly not street movements as such, there are uncanny echoes, rhymes of the global conjuncture of crisis that set the stage for fascism. Lucidly summarizing our own predicament, Merchant writes the following. As growth slows, it increasingly becomes a zero-sum affair, with the gains of the few only coming at the expense of the many. And in a capitalist economy, this means sacrificing the livelihood of the vast majority to the need for continuing profitability. The materialist kernel of the great moving right show that has progressives petrified and oligarchs cheering lies in a planetary crisis of profitability, a crisis of growth, and the disintegration of the neoliberal Washington consensus and its material bases. While much of the billionaire class and the directorships of multinational corporations or financial institutions are still betting on progressive neoliberalism, a la Biden or Harris, to shore up the system, a capitalist bloc has lined up behind the likes of Trump and Vance. As Adam Tooze recently outlined, this comprises venture capitalists like Thiel, mid-tier private equity, so-called little tech, and an ample American gentry of millionaire car dealership and dry cleaning chain owners in tune with Trump and Vance's crusade against so-called woke capital in the Beltway swamp. There's also previous analyses of the same sort made by Mike Davis all the way going back to the Reagan win in the 80s about, again, these kind of lumpen millionaires, so to speak, right, that make up the core of much of the funding, rather than people at the head of financial institutions that are much more tied to systemic interest. Even more significantly, a growing consensus in the US, straddling capitalist interests and the national security establishment, has met the crisis of the idea and reality of free trade with an increasingly belligerent stance towards China. That watchword of the Trump presidency has been doubled down on by the Biden administration itself. Witness, for instance, how it first imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electrical vehicles and is now banning car-related software and hardware originating in China, faced with what the US auto industry fears as, quote, an extinction-level event. The economic war with China has thus presented another voluble moment of convergence for liberal centrists and rightist reactionaries, alongside the shared support for the Israeli war machine. As Tooze has recently observed, in fact, linking these two elements, I quote, this is from a Guardian article from like last week, I think, or just a few days ago. The geoeconomic policy of the US toward China under Biden is a continuation of the revisionism first seen under Trump. Bidenomics is MAGA for thinking people. The trend toward economic nationalism has also been manifest in the continued support for increasing levels of domestic fossil fuel extraction, including by liberals claiming to contend with the epical threats posed by the climate catastrophe. When VP Kamala Harris reaffirmed her refusal to ban fracking, resigning on prior declarations, she boasted, I quote, "We have had the largest increase in domestic oil production in history because of an approach that recognizes that we cannot rely on foreign oil." And in the same answer in which she attacked, this is from the debate, in which she attacked Trump's climate denialism and celebrated the support of Sean Fain and the United Auto Workers Union, she declared that her government invested $1 trillion in clean energy while breaking records for domestic gas production, explicitly linking this energy strategy to boosting American manufacturing and opening up more auto plants. A Republican Party whose raison d'etre for the past half-century has been the demolition of workers' rights and social welfare might pose as the nemesis of so-called Wall Street barons, a term that Vance likes to use, but is still the vehicle for an oligarchic project spearheaded by far-right movement philanthropy. to eliminate all regulatory hindrances to the eye-watering accumulation of private capital. Trump's unguarded praise for Musk's layoffs of Tesla workers, which prompted the UAW to file charges, is just the tip of the iceberg, while Project 2025's plans to undermine the recent advances made by the National Labor Relations Board signal the predictable direction of travel. Now, Democrats might have an easy time lampooning the claims of Trump the scab, as the t-shirts now go, and Vance the venture capitalist to be the paladins of the American worker. They can stake a claim to be the real Made in USA party, the progressive wing of economic nationalism. But by the same token, they seem both unwilling and incapable of truly fighting head-on the economic chauvinism that fuels the MAGA brand. Like some of their European centrist counterparts, think Emmanuel Macron, they've plumbed for the doomed tactic of talking tough on so-called illegal immigration as a way to undercut xenophobia. But once migration is cast as a problem, it will always be to the benefit of the far right, which does not need to deliver solutions, but is always most at ease diverting social malaise away from structures to scapegoats. Democrats may defend their record on supposedly less vicious large-scale deportations as a lesser evil, but are deluded if they think this will stand as an antidote to mass deportation now as an electoral rallying cry. It might seem to some that with the implosion of boosterism about free trade and globalization, we have left neoliberalism behind. But this would be to forget that in critical ways, racialized ideologies anchored in a kind of market nationalism were key to neoliberalism's consolidation in the late 1970s and 1980s. Neoliberalism's racialized anti-democratic animus creates the material and ideological conditions for efforts to win popular interpolations for the far right in the electoral arena and beyond. The modality through which fascist potentials or trajectories emerge out of neoliberalism's disruptive strains involves turbocharging inherent traits of the neoliberal order: spoliation of nature for the sake of profit, attacks on the distribution of the social wage, glorification of possessive individualism, or predatory entrepreneurialism, under the cover of a challenge to some of its supposedly defining dimensions. The anti-statism of contemporary reaction marries culture war themes and corporate diktats, especially those of fossil capital, and think of how attractive to such interests is Steve Bannon's infamous call for the so-called deconstruction of the administrative state, which again is read as a regulatory bonfire, the elimination of the Environmental Protection Agency, of the Department of Education, and so on and so forth, right? That's the attraction behind what the culture war carries as a war on, DEI departments or what have you. In his germinal analyses of Thatcherism, Stuart Hall demonstrated, in ways still profoundly pertinent to our moment, how what he called authoritarian populism gestated in the 1960s and 1970s around a concatenation of racialized moral panics. This process played a key mediating, consolidating, and reproducing function for the rise of neoliberalism to political preeminence. Again, one that was very much forgotten in the sort of acid-driven amnesia of the 1990s. Racism was in this sense a kind of internal supplement to neoliberalism. In Hall's Gramscian terminology, it made it possible, under the specific condition of a crisis-racked England, to neutralize the contradiction between the people and the state power bloc and to win popular interpolations so decisively for the right. Authoritarian populism could accordingly be understood as, to quote Hall, the project central to the politics of Thatcherism to ground neoliberal politics directly in an appeal to the people, to root them in the essentialist categories of common sense experience and practical moralism, and this to construct, not simply awaken, classes, groups, and interests into a particular definition of the people. This construction was and remains racialized by successive figuration of the non or unpeople. In the UK, from young Black proletarians figured as muggers in the late 1970s, as in Hall et al.'s studies Policing the Crisis, to Muslims supposedly on a path to radicalization, to most recently Eastern European workers threatening British jobs. In its English variant, neoliberalism in power was first articulated as a national populism, and in the Falklands venture, which incidentally I saw, Starmer now waxing nostalgic about in his depressing Thatcher tribute act, a regenerated social imperialism, and such it largely remains. Whence the critical function of vanishing mediators such as Enoch Powell, whose more overt and combative racist rhetoric seeded a more capacious successor. a dynamic paralleled by the relation between Goldwater and Nixon in the US context, or the role of the Front National in accelerating the rightward drift of mainstream French politics, a kind of double act. For Hall, the ideological crusade of the mid-1970s required penetration into, as he put it, some of the core and root social ideas in the population, and the staging of a kind of popular ventriloquism that could draw on the real material sources of popular discontent, securing people to the practices of the dominant bloc and drawing on the massively conservative force of traditional and uncorrected common sense. A neoliberalism that entered power as a nationalist or indeed neo-imperialist populism, instrumentalizing racist moral panics and racialized and gendered class struggle. And we also forget, of course, that neoliberalism entered not just through these racialized discourses, but as a Cold War, in fact, as a second Cold War practice, right? This also prepared the contemporary resurgence of the far right that remains based on not the reversal, but the consummation of competitive individualism. This is a sentence from Marcuse from the 30s. As evidenced in US, UK, Brazilian, German, and other scenarios, there are no cordons sanitaires between combative neoliberalisms and the multiple variants of contemporary reaction, including neo or post-fascist ones. Under changed conditions, the imperative remains the same, to ground policies aimed at shoring up capital accumulation and ruling class privilege, from fossil capital subsidies to tax cuts for billionaires, regulatory bonfires to economic war against China, in appeals to the people or even to the worker. Thank you.